Welcome back, everyone. In today's video, we're diving into a super powerful trick: how to configure the same class for different configurations using configuration properties. Trust me, this is a game changer. Now, picture this: you need to set up multiple databases, maybe a master and a slave, or you have to configure several SFTP servers, or even manage multiple email accounts. Creating a separate class for each configuration? That's a lot of extra work, right? For example, configuring 2 SFTP servers would mean creating 2 separate classes, and that's just messy. But don't worry, we've got a better way. Today, I'll show you how to use one class for handling the same type of properties across different configurations. This keeps your code super clean, reusable, and way more efficient. Let's jump right in and see it in action. Today, we're going to create an email config class and learn how to inject properties for Gmail and Outlook, all in one class. It might seem tricky to manage multiple email services in a single class, but I'm here to show you just how simple it is. You'll see how to easily configure Gmail and Outlook properties using configuration properties, step by step. By the end of this video, you'll be able to handle multiple configurations in the same class like a pro, and you'll never forget how to do it. Let's dive in and get this setup running smoothly. Create the email config class right now. Follow along as we set everything up step by step. Add some key fields: host, port, username, and password. Added data to automatically generate getters, setters. Add at no-args constructor and at all-args constructor to generate constructor. And at builder to allow easy, readable object creation. Now, let's jump in and create the email configuration class. This will handle the actual configuration setup for our Gmail and Outlook properties. Since this is a configuration class, let's go ahead and annotate it with @configuration. This tells Spring that this class holds the configuration beans and settings. Alright, now let's dive into how we can inject multiple properties. But first, let's break down what happens when we use configuration properties annotation at the class level. As you can see on my screen, in the user config class, we've used both the @configuration and @configuration properties annotations. Now, if you remember from our previous video on Spring Boot configurations, we need an object to act as a container for the configuration data. Spring Boot works its magic by fetching the data defined in our configuration files, like application.properties or application.yml, and automatically populating this object with the values it finds. It's a super smooth process, and Spring makes sure everything fits together seamlessly. Now, here's where the magic of the @configuration annotation kicks in. It basically tells Spring, hey, pay attention to this class. It holds some important configuration details. When Spring starts its component scanning process, it comes across this class. Recognizing the @configuration annotation, Spring creates an instance of the userconfig class and registers it as a Spring bean in the application context. But here's a key point: at this stage, the userconfig bean is still an empty shell. It exists, yes, but it doesn't yet contain any configuration data. That's where the real magic happens next. Alright folks, here's where the real magic happens. Spring, ever the watchful detective, spots the @configuration properties annotation and immediately knows, this calls for some extra configuration wizardry. Think of @configuration properties as a treasure map, guiding Spring to the hidden gems of configuration data. The prefix we've set, user, acts like a key, unlocking all the related configuration treasure hidden in our application.yml or application.properties file. Now, with that map in hand, Spring embarks on a treasure hunt. It carefully sifts through all the configuration settings that start with user. But hold on, Spring isn't just blindly grabbing everything. Oh no. It's a clever cookie. Spring checks each key and compares it to the fields in our userconfig class. When it finds a match, it injects the corresponding value into the right field of our userconfig object, like a master craftsman fitting each piece into place. But here's the cool part: if Spring stumbles upon a key that doesn't have a matching field in userconfig, it doesn't break a sweat. Spring just skips it like a good party guest who only crashes if invited, and moves on, making sure to fill in all the fields it can. By the end of this process, our userconfig object, which started as a blank slate, is now packed with all the configuration data it needs to work like a charm. And just like that, Spring does all the heavy lifting for us. Here, two things are required. First, the bean is required, and second, we need the @configuration properties annotation to inject the configuration data. The bean acts as the container for our configuration data, and the @configuration properties annotation is what tells Spring to populate the bean with data from application.yml or application.properties. In our previous example, we applied the annotations directly to the userconfig class. However, now that we need to create multiple beans, we'll approach this a little differently. Can we create beans using the @bean annotation? Absolutely. If you're new to creating beans this way, don't worry. Just click on the icon to watch our quick guide on Java configuration for a better understanding. Now that our beans are all set up, the next step is injecting the configuration data into them. Just like we did before with a combination of @configuration and @configuration properties, we'll use @configuration properties alongside @bean. This powerful duo ensures that Spring will automatically inject the configuration data into our beans, making everything much easier and cleaner. Now, let's move to the email configuration class. First things first, let's create the email config bean for our Gmail configuration. Alright, here's the easy part. We don't need to do much, just create a new email config object and return it. Simple as that. Watch me do it on the screen. Now, it's time to inject Gmail's configuration into our email config bean. Just like we discussed a little earlier, we can use @configuration properties alongside our bean to inject the configuration data. So, let's go ahead and add @configuration properties next to our bean definition, and specify the prefix as email.gmail. Now, here's what Spring is going to do. Once we return the email config bean, Spring will look at the @configuration properties annotation. It'll recognize the email.gmail prefix and go hunting in application.yml or application.properties for any configuration data that matches this prefix. Once Spring finds the data, it will inject the corresponding values directly into the email config bean. Now, similarly, let's define a bean for Outlook email config. Just like we did for Gmail, we'll create a bean for Outlook, allowing us to handle the Outlook-specific configuration. Alright, now for the fun part. For the Outlook email config bean, we're going to use a different prefix in @configuration properties, email.outlook. What's cool about this is that Spring will automatically inject only the configuration data that matches the email.outlook prefix from application.yml or application.properties. Here's the magic. By defining two separate beans, email config for Gmail and Outlook email config for Outlook, and assigning a unique prefix to each, email.gmail for Gmail and email.outlook for Outlook, Spring automatically knows which configuration data belongs to which bean. This way, Gmail and Outlook get their specific configuration data injected, and no mix-ups happen. Spring makes sure each bean gets exactly the data it needs, all by itself. Alright, now it's time to add this configuration data into application.yml, just like we did with userconfig before. Alright, let's get started. First, we're going to add email.gmail in our application.yml. Inside this, define the key properties, host. Next, add port and its value. Next, username and password. Now, let's do the same for email.outlook. This will go right under the email section, just like Gmail. Define the same key properties, host, port, username, and password, but the values will be different to match Outlook's configuration. Now, here's the magic. Gmail properties will automatically get injected into the Gmail bean, and Outlook properties into the Outlook bean. But we're not stopping here. Let's build a quick REST API to test if everything's working perfectly. We'll check if the data is getting injected correctly, just like we discussed. Before we move forward with the API, let's first inject the Gmail config and Outlook email config into our configuration properties demo controller. Define two variables to hold these configurations. Now, let's inject the Gmail config and Outlook email config beans using constructor injection. If you're not familiar with specific bean injection, don't worry. You can check out our videos on constructor injection and at qualifier annotation to understand it better. Follow same step as I do on my screen. Next up, let's create a brand new REST GET API with the endpoint /multiple/configuration/properties/demo. This endpoint will help us verify that everything is set up correctly and ensure that our configuration properties are being injected properly. Add a query param called email type to our endpoint. Here's the plan. If email type is set to Gmail, we'll return the Gmail config. If it's anything else, like Outlook, we'll return the Outlook email config. Now, instead of directly returning the bean, let's create a new email config object and manually populate the data for Gmail and Outlook. We'll return this object instead. Why, you ask? Well, if we just return the bean directly, we might hit an error like HTTP message writer not found. To avoid that, we'll populate the data ourselves and send it back with no issues. Alright, the code is in place. Let's start the application now and see everything in action. The application is up and running. Now, let's switch over to Postman. Alright, let's hit our endpoint with email type equals Gmail and see if it fetches the Gmail configuration. As you can see on the screen, we got the expected response for Gmail. This matches exactly what we configured earlier in our application.yml. Alright, now let's test it for Outlook. Let's hit the same endpoint but this time with email type set to Outlook. As you can see on the screen, this time we got the configuration data for Outlook. This means everything is working perfectly as expected. Wow, what a journey! In this video, we nailed how to use a single class for multiple configurations with ease. We created beans for Gmail and Outlook, injected the correct properties, and verified everything with a REST API. And guess what? It all worked flawlessly. But wait, there's more. In our next video, we're leveling up. Ever wondered how to use properties files other than the default application.properties or application.yml? Well, that's exactly what we'll cover, unlocking even more flexibility for your Spring Boot applications. If you found this video helpful, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps us going. See you in the next one.